We're back, chapter 12, page 199. It's a short chapter. Mother, Mother. Marsha Colby and her husband Glenn may have been poor, but they always gave their family all their love. A white woman from rural Alabama town, 43-year-old Marsha already had 6 kids when she discovered she was pregnant with the 7th. Martha knew that a pregnancy at her age was very risky, but she couldn't afford to see a doctor. One day while she was taking a bath, she went into labor extremely early and gave birth to a stillborn son. She desperately tried to revive the infant, but he never took a breath. The baby's stillbirth might have remained a private tragedy for Martha and her family had it not been for a nosy neighbor who had long been suspicious of the Colbys. Debbie Cook noticed that Martha Colby was no longer pregnant but did not have a baby, which stirred her interest. Cook involved the police in hopes that they would investigate the absent infant. Unbelievably, Marsha Colby, a few short weeks after delivering her stillborn son, soon found herself arrested and charged with capital murder. The jury on Mrs. Colby's case returned a verdict of guilty on 1 count of capital murder. The trial court sentenced her to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, and a short while later she found herself shackled in a prison van heading to Julia Tutwiler Prison for Women. Between 1990 and 2005, a new prison opened in the United States every 10 days. Prison growth and the prison industrial complex, the business interests that capitalize on prison construction, made imprisonment profitable. Incarceration became the answer to everything. Healthcare problems like drug addiction, poverty that led someone to write a bad check, child behavior disorders, managing the mentally disabled, undocumented immigration. The solution, according to legislators, was to send people to prison. Never before had so much lobbying money been spent to expand Americans' prison population. Block sentencing reforms create new crime categories and sustain the fear and anger that fuel mass incarceration than during the last 25 years in the United States. In the United States, the number of women sent to prison increased 646% between 1980 and 2010, with close to 200,000 women in jails and prisons in America and over 1 million women under the supervision or control of the criminal justice system. The incarceration of women has reached record levels. Most incarcerated women, nearly 2/3, are in prison for nonviolent, low-level drug crimes or property crimes. Drug laws in particular have had a huge impact on the number of women sent to prison. So have 3-strike laws, which seriously increase sentences for people with previous convictions. At the time of Marsha Colby's arrest, all 5 of the women who were on Alabama's death row were condemned for the unexplained death of their young children or the deaths of abusive spouses or boyfriends, all of them. In fact, nationwide, most women on death row are awaiting execution for a family crime involving an allegation of child abuse or domestic violence involving a male partner. Murder of a child by a parent is horrific and is usually complicated by serious mental illness, but these cases also tend to create distortion and bias. Police and prosecutors have been influenced by the media coverage, and a presumption of guilt has now fallen on thousands of women, particularly poor women in difficult circumstances, whose children die unexpectedly. In a nation that spends more on health care than any other country in the world, the inability of many poor women to get adequate health care, including prenatal and postpartum care, has been a serious problem in this country for decades. The criminalization of infant mortality and the persecution of poor women whose children die have taken on new dimensions in 21st century America, as prisons across the country began to bear witness. In addition to unexplained deaths of infants, poor women have also been criminalized for other kinds of bad parenting. In 2006, Alabama passed a law that made it a felony to expose a child to a dangerous environment in which the child could encounter drugs. Ostensibly, this measure was passed to protect children living in households where there were meth labs or drug trafficking operations. But the law was applied much more broadly, and soon thousands of mothers with children living in poor, marginalized communities where drug addiction are rampant were at risk of being prosecuted. In time, the Alabama Supreme Court interpreted the term environment to include the womb and the term child to include a fetus. Pregnant women could now be criminally prosecuted and sent to prisons for decades if there was any evidence that they had used drugs at any point during their pregnancy. Dozens of women have been sent to prison under this law in recent years rather than getting the help they need. Built in the 1940s, Tutwiler Prison is situated in Wetumpka, Alabama. Named after Julia Tutwiler, a woman who promoted the education of prisoners and championed humane conditions of confinement, Tutwiler has become the opposite of what its namesake stood for. A dangerous nightmare for the woman trapped there. Courts have repeatedly found the prison unconstitutionally overcrowded, with almost twice the number of women incarcerated as it was designed to hold. I had started challenging conditions of confinement at Tutwiler in the mid-1980s as a young attorney with the Southern Prisoners Defense Committee. At the time, I was shocked to find women in prison for such minor offenses. One of the first incarcerated women I have ever met was a young mother who was serving a long prison sentence for writing checks to buy her 3 young children Christmas gifts without sufficient funds in her account. None of the checks was more than $150. She was not unique. Thousands of women have been sentenced to lengthy terms in prison for writing bad checks or for minor property crimes that trigger mandatory minimum sentences. The collateral consequences of incarcerating women are significant. Approximately 75 to 80% of incarcerated women are mothers with minor children. Nearly 65% had minor children living with them at the time of their arrest. Children have become more vulnerable and at risk as a result of their mother's incarceration and will remain so for the rest of their lives, even after their mothers come home. In 1996, a Congress passed legislation that needlessly included a provision that authorized states to ban people with drug convictions from public benefits and welfare. This misguided law greatly affects the lives of formerly incarcerated women with children, most of whom were imprisoned for drug crimes. These women and their children can no longer live in public housing, receive food stamps, or access basic services. In the last 20 years, we've created a new class of untouchables in America, made up of our most vulnerable mothers and children. Martha wandered through her first days at Tutwiler in a state of disbelief. She met other women like herself who had been in prison after having given birth to stillborn babies. Afernia McClendon, a young black teenager from Opeka, Alabama, got pregnant in high school and didn't tell her parents. She delivered at just over 5 months and left the stillborn babies remain in a drainage ditch. When they were discovered, she was interrogated by police until she acknowledged that she couldn't be 100% sure the infant hadn't moved before death, even though the premature delivery made that extremely unlikely. Threatened with death penalty, she too was in prison for having an unplanned pregnancy and little access to health care. After we met Marsha Colby, we immediately began working on her appeal. We decided to challenge the state's case and the way the jury had been selected. Charlotte Marson, a Rhodes Scholar and former student of mine, was now a senior attorney at EJI. She and staff attorney Kristen Nelson met with Marsha repeatedly. Marsha would talk about her case, the challenge of keeping her family together while she was in prison, and a range of other problems. But it was the sexual violence at Tutwiler that mostly frequently came up during these visits. Women at Tutwiler were being raped, sexually harassed, exploited, and abused by male prison guards in countless ways. The male warden allowed the male guards entry into the showers during prison encounters. Officers leered at the naked women and made crude comments and suggestive threats. Women had no privacy in the bathrooms where male officers could watch them use the toilet. There were dark corners and hallways, terrifying spaces at Tutwiler where women could be beaten or sexually assaulted. EJI had asked the Department of Corrections to install security cameras in the dorms, but they refused. The culture of sexual violence was so pervasive that even the prison chaplain was sexually assaulting women when they came to the chapel. Charlotte and I took on the case of another woman who had filed a federal civil suit after she was raped at Tutwiler. The details of her experience were so painful that we could no longer look past the violence. We started an investigation for which we interviewed over 50 women. We were truly shocked to see how widespread the problem of sexual violence had become. Several women had been raped and become pregnant. Even when DNA testing confirmed that male officers were the father of these children, very little was done about it. Some officers were temporarily reassigned to other duties or other prisons, only to wind up back at Tutwiler, where they continued to prey on inmates. We eventually filed a complaint with the U.S. Department of Justice and released several public reports about the problem, which received widespread media coverage. Tutwiler made it onto a list of the 10 worst prisons in America, compiled by Mother Jones. Legislative hearings and police changes at the prison followed. Male guards are now banned from the shower areas and toilets, and a new warden has taken over the facility. Marsha held on despite these challenges and started advocating for some of the younger women. We were devastated when the Court of Criminal Appeals issued a ruling affirming her conviction and sentence. We sought review in the Alabama Supreme Court and won a new trial based on the trial judge's refusal to exclude people from jury service who were biased and could not be impartial. Marsha and our team were thrilled. Local officials in Baldwin County less so. They were threatening re-prosecution. We involved expert pathologists and persuaded local authorities that there was no basis on which to convict Marsha of murder. It took 2 years to settle the legal case and then another year of wrangling with the Department of Corrections before Marsha was finally freed in December 2012 after 10 years of wrongful imprisonment. On the day of her release from Tutwiler, Marsha had come to the EJI office to thank everyone. Her husband and her 2 daughters had picked her up at Tutwiler. Her youngest daughter, who was about 12, had reduced most of our staff to tears because she refused to let go of her mother the entire time. She clung to Martha's waist. She kept hold of her arm and leaned into her as if she intended never to let anyone physically separate them ever again. We took pictures with Marsha and some of the staff, and her daughter is in every shot because she refused to let her mother go. That told us a lot about what kind of mom Marsha Colby was. Page 207. Toodles.